So within India, digital humanities is really taking off right now, kind of across the universities. And it's been identified as an area of interest by the educational aspects of the government. So with Professor Nishad Zaidi, who's a professor of English in the Department of Jamia Millia Islamia, we did a Spark project, which was a really massive investment by the Indian government in higher education. And so it involved bringing international collaborators to India, and we also were able to bring two graduate students from Jamia Millia to Michigan State University. And so as part of that project, we did a conference, which is one of the first conferences on digital humanities in India, or at least within an academic context. And that became the basis for the edited volume. And we also wrote a monograph called "The Dreaming of the Digital Divan," which we co-wrote. And so my part was about sort of what happens if we digitize a divan or a collection of poetry. And Professor Zaidi and our other collaborators uh, did a massive survey of the status of South Asian literature on the internet and across languages. And so it's a really exciting project. So within digital humanities, there is a international kind of umbrella organization, and there's been a real movement within India to set up their own kind of conference or set up their own institution. And so a lot of people are very involved in digital humanities. So for our project, we were focused primarily on the central public universities. But there's also a lot of work that's been happening, particularly at the IITs, which are often have a lot of potential because there's often very, very strong humanities faculty, as well as people within the sciences who are collaborating. And so that's been very exciting. I can't say as much about Pakistan or other parts of South Asia. There, within regards to language, there is a very strong South Asian linguistics community who's been collaborating across the South Asian countries for quite some time, and that's a really nice model, I think, to think about for digital humanities research as well. And so minimal computing is a movement that's been happening within the global digital humanities that's interested in a number of things, thinking about the environmental effects of computation, which is quite huge today, particularly with artificial intelligence, things like ChatGPT and the amount of resources that they're using, both in terms of water and electricity, but also thinking about ways of working across the digital divides and doing digital humanities research in places that have less resources, such as humanities departments, whether they're in the States or in India or Pakistan or wherever. And this is something that really resonated with the people I was working with in India. And that's been one of the ways we've been trying to work together in order to come up with methods that are free and open source and don't require a huge amount of servers or other types of equipment in order to do humanities research. And the other thing it's important to note about the digital humanities is that people have been doing digital humanities type research in India for quite some time. There's less sort of state sponsorship and a lot of kind of private endeavors, and that have been very, very significant. Archives and film and of visual culture and such things. So so while digital humanities as an academic field doesn't necessarily hadn't exist the way that it does now, it's something that's been very popular in particularly in India. And so we've coined the term citizen scholars, or repurposed the term citizen scholars, which is something that already exists within the scientific community. So there's an idea of citizen scientists who will, for example, go out and count birds or do other types of measurement. And so much of the work that's happening within the, particularly in relationship to cultural preservation, is happening by private individuals, very passionate private individuals. And so they very much consider them part of our scholarly community as well. And so it's very important to kind of come up with methods that can be used by not only people with huge amounts of resources, but also or academic connections, but just normal people as well. And so thinking about that, part of the thinking about the mutable computing is that there's an idea of trying to reduce the technical stack that's necessary in order to do research. And so if you think about the average humanities student in South Asia, they have a phone for sure. They may have a laptop, maybe not one that's working very well. But there's so much need to preserve cultural heritage. And I think that COVID in particular brought that home to so many of us because we lost so many very important and people, and also people who were involved in this type of research as well. So within South Asia, there in particular languages, there is still a book culture that where and a focus on the printed book, but things have been incredibly quickly have been moving to digital media. So I know a lot of poets who the first place that they post their verses is on Facebook, and there is sort of an immersive experience to literature within the digital space that is becoming more and more influential. We were really interested as we were doing our survey of poetry on South Asian poetic communities on the internet, that the way that poetry is also being tied with images and with videos, and and uh, and finding kind of different forms of expression. Thinking about poetry as data is something that is very shocking to people, but it's interesting from the research perspective in that we can potentially get at aspects of language and literature that we might not be able to otherwise. And so I've been very interested, for example, in the way that sound carries meaning in poetry and trying to think about ways of visualizing that and doing different types of comparison across authors and genres. What's also of interest in relationship to poetry and to literature in general is that, particularly for South Asian languages, so often the literary histories are written within the silo of a particular language. And one of the the reasons for that is that all of the languages are often broken up into separate departments. And so thinking about, and the languages are not, and the poets are not acting in a vacuum. And so thinking about ways of working across languages and across literary histories is something that is very exciting. We're finally at a point where we're able to do optical character recognition for South Asian languages, which is something that seemed very impossible, 20 years ago. And has to do with advances within the artificial intelligence models. And so there's potentially an amazing archive of material that's available, but there's very little uh, digital scholarly editions, for example, of texts that could be then made accessible to scholars, but also machine accessible, meaning that we could do different types of queries over the text themselves. And so that's an area that's of particular interest. Yes, so this is a very big question. The way that the computational linguists will speak of languages like Urdu, and of course there are many more minority languages that have much less digital representation than Urdu, for example, is as lesser resourced languages, and that leads to a number of problems in that there's just not as much text available, as for one thing, and you need data these days in order to um, build um, more advanced systems, and also even for things like thinking about speech to text, something that would be very helpful for people with disabilities, um, as well as other types of people. There, we just don't have enough data available, and so that's something that is a huge concern. And we're finally, as I getting to a point where we can actually do some types of operations on languages like Urdu, which is written in a calligraphic script that were very difficult to even imagine 15 or 20 years ago. And but we need a lot of more data for that. And so there's a lot that's been digitized within South Asian languages, but it's often done in a way where the text is neither easily accessible because of bad metadata, so meaning it's not cataloged properly, and also because it's existing simply as an image, and most of the tools that are available for doing the optical character recognition aren't really using the more contemporary models that could potentially read the text. And so there's with thinking about literature, there's problems with the lack of machine accessible texts, or machine the problem with the amount of machine actionable texts, and the fact that the archives that exist are on there. And there's quite a lot that's available within particular academic institutions have done these massive digitization projects, but it's difficult to find the texts, and then it's difficult to access them in a way that you can do different types of search and other types of queries that you would want to when doing digital humanities research. Yes, so the New Directions Fellowship is a really amazing opportunity that's specific to particular universities, in primarily in North America, but other places as well. That basically allows faculty, mid career faculty, to get retrained in new methodologies. And so what I did was took classes in computer science and data science and linguistics at Michigan State University, and also at the Linguistics Summer Institute, which was that year was in Kentucky. This is a really important institute for the linguists, because it existed even before there were linguistics departments. And so that was a really amazing opportunity. And what's difficult is that I did that a few years ago, and things particularly within artificial intelligence, have moved so quickly since then. But my interest that developed when I was working on my book on Nunim Rashid involved, one of the aspects I was really interested in was thinking about the way that sound works within poetry. And in part that was driven by Rashid's work in developing Azad Nazm, or free verse, which was breaking somewhat with the structures of Urdu prosody and forms. But what Rashid always said is, like, the important thing is that the sound remains. So you have sort of the trick of there being an experience of the redif and of the rhyme, even though it's not there. And I was really interested too in the work that was being done, particularly in the 60s, and more specifically in India, that was really focused on looking at the way that sound works within Urdu poetry. And so I was thinking about people like Mughni Tabassum, who's a critic based in Hyderabad, wrote these really interesting articles about Rashid's poetry in relationship to sound. And that's something that's very difficult to talk about when writing, or to convey through writing. And so one of the ideas for the Publics of Sound project was to look at the way that poetry carries meaning through sound, through analysis of the way that meter works, and also thinking about the rhythm. And it's so interesting within Urdu, and in particular because there's basically a system of prosody that's inherited primarily from Persian and earlier through from Arabic. And there's another system that's associated with now more with Hindi and also with Sanskrit, and both of them are durational, so it's not like stress the way that meter works within English. But of course, there is stress within the languages. But there's the ability of the poets to kind of play with those conventions, and so that's one thing I was interested in looking at was thinking about the way that form is working across languages. And so, as part of that project, I was collaborating with a poet in Pakistan named Ahmed Atta, and we originally had thought that it would just be a very kind of more Urdu focused project. But then when the two of us got together, it just kind of expanded into many other languages. So I'm still in the process of making those materials available. But I mean, it was after COVID in particular, we lost so many of the people that we've recorded. So it's very important to make those recordings available. And so I was thinking of particularly of not only being able to listen to the poems and to be able to view the text at the same time, but also to think about ways that one could visualize the way that form is working, and meter and so on, while also listening to the poems. My one regret was not also having them videotaped, and because I thinking about gesture in particular is so significant. But it was had enough trouble dealing with the sound recordings at that point. But next time, I think definitely videotaping as well. Yeah, it's a very interesting question to think about, because Rashid's work very quickly became challenging to different ideas of collective identity. And I think the real pivotal volume here is Iran Mein Ajnabi, which he published in 1957, and it is basically framed as a response to his experience of Iran during World War II as an officer in the British Indian Army. And so, for a person like Rashid, who had done an MA in Persian, and also was uh, looking to Iran perhaps as a moment of cultural heritage, basically kind of found himself in Iran and also experiencing a different form of imperialism in the situation of World War II Iran, where Iran very much kind of became in many ways an early experience of the Cold War. And within Urdu criticism, there's a lot of dismissal of Rashid because he spent so much time outside of the country, and there's this sense of him basically kind of losing his ties to both the language and also to place. And so there are definitely precedents to thinking about attachments that are beyond the nation or a particular community within Urdu. And I think one of the areas that Rashid's one of the influential figures for Rashid is definitely Iqbal, and some poet that he's very clearly in dialogue with. And Iqbal so famously moved from celebrating the Indian nation to concentrating on the global Islamic community. And so that's one of the issues that the critics have been dealing with. And I think there's been a move within some of the more recent scholarship to try and recapture Rashid as a Pakistani poet and as a Pakistani nationalist. In part, that's been difficult because of his cremation, and the moves to do that have kind of focused more on thinking of his as a Muslim poet or as a Pakistani poet. But basically, it's his experience of partition and also of the war and also of the global situation really kind of seemed to call for a an approach to community that isn't tied to a particular identity.